Some people may ask whether geography still matters in an age of internet and global supply chains. This book argues it matters more than ever. It offers a vivid image to explain why. Drop a stone in a pond, and watch the ripples spread outward, then bounce back off the rim. For most of the 1990s, the world acted as if that pond had no rim at all. This book is the story of geography's revenge for that mistake. It's also the story of the statesmen and scholars who saw the rim coming all along. The book is called The Revenge of Geography. Its subtitle is What the Map Tells Us About Coming Conflicts and the Battle Against Fate. It asks a pointed question. Why did so many confident predictions about a borderless, post-Cold War world turn out wrong? The fashionable answer in the 1990s was that globalization had made geography obsolete. This book argues the opposite. It revives a group of unfashionable thinkers from a century ago. All of them insisted that mountains, deserts, and coastlines still set real limits. No government can escape those limits, no matter how good its intentions. The author, Robert D. Kaplan, spent more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent. He reported from Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of other contested places. He has advised the Pentagon. He also serves as a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security in Washington. His earlier books on the Balkans and the post-Cold War world had already made his reputation. He treats the physical map as seriously as any embassy cable. Kaplan himself has crossed many of the borders this book discusses, on foot or by bus. He didn't just read about them. He once crossed from Mexico into Arizona on foot. He compares that experience directly to crossing the old Berlin Wall. A single border, in an instant, could announce 2 entirely different worlds. Let's start where the book starts, with a single image from 1989. When the Berlin Wall fell, a strange optimism took hold in Washington. A former State Department official named Francis Fukuyama had just published an essay. It was called The End of History, and it argued that liberal democracy had triumphed. The great arguments over ideology were finally over. For a few years, it really did seem that way. Old walls were just artificial lines, soon to be erased by the spread of free markets and elections everywhere. Then came Bosnia, then Kosovo, then September 11th, then Iraq. This book traces what it calls a journey from Bosnia to Baghdad. That's the path by which America's confidence in painless intervention curdled into something much harder. The lesson of Iraq, the book insists, was not that intervention is always wrong. It was that geography, history, and culture set real limits on what outside power can accomplish anywhere. Good intentions don't erase those limits. To understand why those limits are real, the book turns to a handful of mostly forgotten thinkers. They took geography seriously long before it became unfashionable to do so. The very oldest of them isn't a modern strategist at all, but the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. Herodotus wrote 2,400 years ago about the wars between Greece and Persia. He treated terrain, climate, and the habits of distant peoples as central to understanding any conflict, not as background color. The book treats him as the founding voice of the whole tradition it's reviving. Thinking geographically about power isn't some 20th century invention. It's one of the oldest habits of serious historical thought. The first specifically modern thinker is Sir Halford Mackinder, a British geographer. In 1904 he delivered a single lecture that would echo through the entire 20th century. Mackinder argued that the vast interior of Eurasia, what he called the heartland, was the true pivot of world history. Whoever controlled that heartland, he wrote in a famous and chilling formula, would command Eurasia. And whoever commanded Eurasia would command the world. His theory wasn't really about any one empire. It was about something else. The flat, landlocked core of the supercontinent had spent centuries launching horse-mounted nomads outward, wave after wave, in every direction. The embattled nations on the receiving end were shaped by their need to survive those onslaughts. This was true from Russia to France to China. Mackinder's ideas were tragically hijacked. A German geographer named Karl Horschafer had once briefed a young, imprisoned Adolf Hitler on geopolitics. Horschafer twisted Mackinders' heartland theory into a justification for Nazi conquest. His student Rudolf Hess carried these ideas directly into the inner circle of the Nazi Party. The book is careful to separate the two men's legacies. Mackinder believed in a balance of power between independent states as the foundation of freedom. Horschafer believed in obliterating that balance altogether. It's a sobering reminder. The same geographic facts can be read by a Democrat seeking stability or twisted by a tyrant seeking conquest. A second key thinker, the Dutch-American strategist Nicholas Spykman, refined Mackinder's idea for the American context. Spykman argued that the truly decisive territory wasn't the empty heartland itself. It was the populous, coastal rimland surrounding it, stretching from Europe through the Middle East to East Asia. Containing Soviet expansion along exactly that rimland became the guiding logic of American strategy. It would stay that way for decades of the Cold War. Spykman also did something Mackinder never bothered with. He took the map of the Western Hemisphere seriously. He called the Caribbean basin the American Mediterranean. Commanding it, he argued, was the geographic foundation of America's entire status as a world power. Spykman drew a sharp line through South America too. The real divide on that continent, he argued, isn't north versus south, as commonly imagined. It's the lands north of the Amazon's jungle versus everything south of it. That divide is wide. Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires, the book notes, sit no closer to New York than they do to Lisbon. We'll return to why that argument matters enormously today. A third thinker was the American naval officer Alfred Thayer Mahan. He made the case that sea power, not land power, ultimately determines who rules the world. Mahan pointed to Hannibal's invasion of Italy as proof. It was Rome's command of the Mediterranean, not any single land battle, that doomed it. Hannibal's army wasted away marching overland through Gaul. Roman legions, meanwhile, simply sailed between Spain and Italy, unmolested and fresh, because the sea itself belonged to Rome. He also coined the very term Middle East. With eerie precision, he named the nations that would remain pivotal a century later: China, Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey. Strikingly, the book notes, it's now India and especially China who study Mahan most avidly today. They build blue water navies explicitly designed around his ideas. Meanwhile, the country that produced him grows more cautious about projecting sea power abroad. Two more thinkers round out the book's intellectual toolkit, and they push the argument from the past into the present. The historian William McNeill taught for decades at the University of Chicago. He wrote an enormous book called The Rise of the West. It traces how civilizations from Sumer to Europe were shaped above all by their geography. They then changed each other through constant contact, trade, and invasion. His Chicago colleague Marshall Hodgson focused more narrowly on the Greater Middle East. He called it the oikoumene, an ancient Greek term for the inhabited heart of the world. It stretched from the Nile to the Oxus River. Both scholars insisted that history was never a story of separate civilizations developing in isolation. It was a story of constant friction along shared frontiers, friction that geography itself had set up in advance. A more contemporary voice, the Yale professor Paul Bracken, adds an urgent modern twist to all of this. Bracken argues that Eurasia is now experiencing what he calls a crisis of room. Missile ranges, urban populations, and disruptive new technologies have collapsed the old buffers of distance. Conflict used to be slower and rarer because of those buffers. An unbroken belt of countries now stretches from Israel to North Korea. All of them possess nuclear or chemical weapons, and the missiles to deliver them. Bracken calls this the second nuclear age, distinct from the icy, predictable standoff of the Cold War. During the Cold War, both superpowers approached their weapons with detachment and careful calculation. Many of today's newer nuclear states, the book warns, lack that same bureaucratic restraint. the odds of miscalculation rise even as the weapons themselves grow more widely available. Meanwhile, the world's population has shifted decisively into cities. Dozens of sprawling megacities now exist across the Middle East and Asia that didn't exist a century ago. Crowded, claustrophobic, and armed to the teeth, this is the real stage for 21st century geopolitics, the book argues. Washington may not have fully absorbed the point yet. Population is part of this crowding too. There were only 25 cities on Earth with more than 10 million people as this book was written. Almost all of the growth still to come will happen in the developing world. The book draws on the writer Elias Canetti's classic study of crowd psychology to explain what happens next. People packed into vast, anonymous megacities increasingly seek the shelter and identity of the crowd. That crowd might organize around nationalism, religious revival, or just as easily, a democracy movement broadcasting itself on social media. The Arab Spring and the radicalization of Islam, the book suggests, share the same root. Both are faces of the same underlying urban transformation. Armed with these thinkers, the book turns to the actual map of the early 21st century. It moves region by region, starting with Europe itself. Europe's intricate coastline is longer than the Earth's own circumference. That coastline, plus a rich river network, gave rise to dozens of competing nations. The book argues this happened instead of one single empire forming. Meanwhile, the harsh, productive soils of the north eventually outpaced the south. Mediterranean societies stayed more rigid and oligarchic, clustered as they were around poorer soil. That old north-south divide, the book points out, is exactly the fault line now running through Europe's debt crisis. Europe's coastline alone runs 23,000 miles, longer than the circumference of the planet itself. It's carved into countless peninsulas, bays, and islands that no single empire could ever fully absorb. That fractured geography explains it better than any single battle or treaty could. It's why Europe became a continent of competing nations, rather than one durable empire like China. Germany's economic dominance flows directly from its central, riverine position on the continent. The book singles out Greece as the most telling test case of all. Greece sits at the exact seam between Europe's Catholic West and its Orthodox East. It's geographically equidistant between Brussels and Moscow, and historically tied to Byzantium rather than Rome. Its prolonged financial crisis, the book suggests, is really an old civilizational fault line. It just resurfaced in the language of bond yields and bailout terms. Russia gets an entire chapter built around a single image, the towering, beautiful, and terrifying wall of the Caucasus Mountains. Russia is the world's preeminent land power, the book explains. It stretched across 170 degrees of longitude with almost no natural borders anywhere to protect it. That endless, flat vulnerability was repeatedly overrun by Mongol horsemen for centuries. It produced a society obsessed with security and expansion in equal measure. The bitter cold itself shaped the Russian character, the book argues. Russia's brutal winters and short growing seasons forced farmers into communal labor. They demanded heavy sacrifice from the individual for the group. That pattern long predates communism, though communism would later exploit and intensify it. Modern Russia's pipeline routes through Ukraine and Belarus, the book argues, are simply the latest version of an old reflex. Control your immediate neighborhood because nothing else will save you. The book singles out Kazakhstan as the ultimate modern test of Makinda's old heartland idea. Kazakhstan sits squarely in the middle of that old pivot zone, stretching nearly 1,800 miles across Central Asia. It's astonishingly rich in oil, uranium, and rare minerals. Mackinder assumed some great outside power would always end up controlling the heartland. Instead, the book points out, Kazakhstan's own people now hold that ground themselves. Russia, China, and the West all caught Kazakhstan simultaneously, rather than any one of them conquering it. China's chapter makes a related point from the opposite direction. China lies in roughly the same temperate latitudes as the United States, the book notes. It's blessed with a 9,000-mile coastline full of natural harbors, almost all of them ice-free. For thousands of years, China's central challenge was managing the restless nomadic peoples of its dry northern and western frontiers. These were the very peoples the Great Wall was built to hold back. Meanwhile, its fertile, riverine core grew steadily more cohesive. Unlike Russia, the book argues, China is far less interested in classic military conquest abroad. It pursues influence the way a merchant pursues customers. It secures the oil, minerals, and farmland it needs through trade deals and infrastructure loans rather than tanks. This same dynamic plays out on China's border with India. The two giants once considered each other almost irrelevant to their own security. They were separated, after all, by the highest mountains on Earth. Satellites and reconnaissance aircraft have closed that old distance. India now closely tracks Chinese troop movements in Tibet. China, in turn, watches India's naval build-up in the Andaman Islands with equal unease. The book points to Mongolia as a telling test case of this newer style of expansion. Mongolia is rich in coal, copper, and uranium. China has built road after road into it. The goal isn't conquest, but mining it and absorbing it economically. That's the same patient strategy China once used at home. It settled its own restive province of Inner Mongolia with Han Chinese migrants. India's chapter is built around a paradox. China had one cohesive river cradle to expand outward from. India never had that. It lacked any single geographic nursery for a unified state. Its most dangerous, least defined frontier has always been the northwest. That's the corridor through which waves of Persian, Turkic, and Mongol invaders descended into the Punjab for over 2,000 years. That same fact explains something the book finds revealing. Indian strategists still instinctively think of Afghanistan as part of their own backyard, even though no modern map agrees. The book offers one striking proof. The tomb of Babur, the Central Asian warlord who founded India's Mughal Empire, sits not in Delhi but in Kabul. For centuries, a single empire ruled both Afghanistan and northern India as one connected world. Indian elites have never quite forgotten that fact, even if Pakistan now sits stubbornly in between. Before reaching Iran, the book pauses on Saudi Arabia, the dominant power of the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia's strength, it argues, comes less from population than from sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves. Its deepest vulnerability lies just to its south, in Yemen. Yemen packs almost as many people as Saudi Arabia into a quarter of the land area. By some estimates, it's awash in nearly 3 firearms for every citizen. Yemen is mountainous, never fully colonized, and largely beyond the reach of any central government. It's the kind of ungoverned frontier that geography itself seems to produce. That holds true, the book suggests, regardless of which regime rules from its capital. Iran's chapter makes perhaps the book's boldest single claim. Iran alone straddles both of the region's great energy zones. Of all the countries in the greater Middle East, only Iran touches both the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea. It also bridges the Arab world and Central Asia. That double advantage, the book argues, makes Iran the modern equivalent of Makinda's old heartland pivot. This holds true regardless of who actually governs in Tehran. Iran's reach into neighboring Iraq makes the point concretely. The Shiite holy cities of Najaf and Karbala sit in southern Iraq. They draw pilgrims and theological students from across the Shiite world. They create religious and political ties to Iran that no border fence could ever sever. The Iranian Revolution's clerics built one of the most sophisticated states in the entire Middle East, the book notes. Yet that very sophistication makes the regime's repressive turn all the more wasteful. A freer Iran could likely outshine its neighbors by sheer cultural gravity alone. The book treats the fall of the Shah in 1979 as a hinge point, not a foregone conclusion. A handful of different decisions in Washington, it suggests, might have kept the Shah's reform-minded monarchy in power. Today's Iran might then look more like South Korea than the clerical state it actually became. Turkey's chapter completes the regional survey. It opens with a hidden geographic lever that gets surprisingly little attention. Turkey controls the headwaters of both the Tigris and the Euphrates. Iraq and Syria depend on those rivers for their very survival. The book stresses that Turkey would never actually cut off that water. Doing so would amount to an act of war. But the mere possibility gives Ankara real leverage, especially as Turkey's own dam-building projects expand. Almost no other regional power can match it. It traces how Ataturk deliberately built a secular, Europe-facing republic from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. He governed from inland Ankara, not from cosmopolitan Istanbul. But the book argues that this Western orientation always concealed a contradiction. Ataturk rooted his new nation in the Anatolian heartland, not the old empire's Balkan provinces. By doing so, he inadvertently empowered the far more religious, traditional society of the interior. That force would eventually reassert itself at the ballot box. It would pull Turkey's foreign policy back toward the Middle East. There's an irony buried in Ataturk's own biography here. He was born and raised in Salonika, a cosmopolitan, multilingual port city in northern Greece. There he grew up among Greeks, Jews, and Muslims alike. The architect of Anatolian nationalism was, in other words, a product of something else entirely. He came from Europe's most mixed, worldly Mediterranean edge. The numbers tell the story plainly. Turkey had 20,000 mosques in 1945. By 1985 it had 72,000, growing far faster than the population itself. Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Islamist party finally won power in 2002. Electorally, it was simply catching up with a religious revival that had been quietly building in Anatolia for decades. The book's final and most provocative argument turns the geographic lens back on the United States itself. At a 2009 Washington Conference on Afghanistan Strategy, a historian named Andrew Basevik asked an uncomfortable question. Why was Washington spending trillions of dollars on a fragile, distant state in Central Asia? Meanwhile, a real demographic transformation was unfolding right on America's own southern border. Its long-term consequences for American power would prove far greater. Mexico's population has grown more than five-fold since 1940. Northern Mexico's economy is now deeply fused with the American Southwest through trade and manufacturing. Drug cartel violence, in cities like Ciudad Juarez, has killed tens of thousands. It has begun to resemble outright insurgency. The book's argument is blunt. Fixing Mexico matters more to America's long-term destiny than any war fought in the greater Middle East. The late scholar Samuel Huntington made an even sharper version of this argument in his final book. He warned that Mexican immigration was reshaping the Southwest unusually fast. No earlier immigrant wave had reshaped any other American region so quickly. The book takes Huntington's underlying worry seriously, even while rejecting his proposed remedy of a more rigid, defensive nationalism. A more workable future, it argues, looks like an older partnership. America and Mexico once cooperated quietly against border banditry and the Comanche. That model of cooperation, rather than walls, could apply now to drug cartels instead. Northern Mexico's economy already tells part of that story. Its population has more than doubled since NAFTA took effect in 1994. The US dollar now circulates as a common currency as far south as Culiacan, roughly halfway to Mexico City itself. The book closes on an unmistakably geographic note. America's true 21st century axis, it argues, will run north to south, from Canada through Mexico to Central America. Not simply east to west across its own temperate continent, as patriotic memory prefers to imagine it. Securing a stable, prosperous partnership with Mexico, the book insists, is the indispensable foundation. It's what will let America keep playing its traditional balancing role. That role spans the vastly more crowded Eurasian map. Mackinder first sketched that map out, over a century ago, in a single London lecture hall. What does this body of geographic thinking actually contribute to foreign policy debate? The book enters a real argument here. Did the optimistic, idealistic foreign policy consensus of the 1990s simply ignore uncomfortable physical realities for too long? Its central contribution is reviving a serious intellectual tradition, one running from Mackinder through Spickman and Mahan. That tradition had been dismissed as deterministic and faintly disreputable after its association with Nazi geopolitics. By carefully separating Mackinder's own liberal instincts from Horshafer's totalitarian distortion of them, the book makes a strong case. Taking geography seriously doesn't require believing that maps alone decide the fates of nations. The book also leans heavily on the political theorist Hans Morgenthau. He taught at the University of Chicago, after fleeing Nazi Germany himself. Morgenthau argued that human nature makes constant friction unavoidable. It's driven by fear, self-interest, and a hunger for honor. Good intentions, Morgenthau insisted, guarantee nothing. He pointed out that Neville Chamberlain genuinely wanted peace, and brought disaster. Winston Churchill, driven by raw calculations of power, brought a measure of moral triumph instead. This unsentimental tradition, the book argues, isn't really pessimism. It's simply taking the map, and the limits it imposes, as seriously as any stated ideal. That said, the book's own method invites genuine pushback. Critics have noted a real gap here. A framework built around historical military and economic power has a blind spot. It pays less attention to regions like most of sub-Saharan Africa or the Pacific Islands. Those places simply haven't disturbed the great Eurasian chessboard as directly. The book's confident claims about cultural destiny also draw on contested ground. This is especially true of its discussion of Mexican immigration reshaping American identity. That argument leans on disputed demographic projections. It also leans on Samuel Huntington's own controversial late writing. That leaves room for readers to reach different conclusions from identical facts. And because the book was written in 2011, several of its specific predictions now read differently. They feel like products of a moment that was quickly overtaken. Its forecasts about Turkey, the Arab Spring, and Iran's reformist prospects have all aged unevenly. Yet the book's larger geographic argument still holds up well. What does any of this mean for how we should think about the world today? The book's deepest lesson may be the simplest one. Technology can shrink distance, but it cannot delete it entirely. A foreign policy that ignores the map will eventually be corrected by it, often at painful cost. Consider how often recent headlines have circled back to exactly the places this book flags as pivotal. Think of the Black Sea and the Caucasus, the Strait of Hormuz, the South China Sea. Think of the long, porous border running through the American Southwest. None of those flashpoints are new discoveries. They are the same old fault lines that Mackinder, Spickman, and Mahan identified a century ago. New technology and new ambitions have simply reactivated them. The real argument here was never that geography determines everything. It was that any government, however idealistic, eventually has to negotiate with reality. The mountains, the coastlines, and the neighbors that history handed it don't disappear. The wisest statesmen recognized those limits early. So many others discovered them only the hard way.